Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It is, I guess, Saturday in this case, August 31st, 2024. You're listening and/or watching, and/or watching the latest episode of the Rundown, episode 1. I would potentially call this a weekly podcast, but it really depends on how things go in terms of whether or not you guys like it. This show's survival depends on what you guys think of it and whether or not you'd like to see it continue. So I won't call it a weekly podcast, but it is indeed a podcast where I do, in fact, talk about all the happenings going on into the video game industry as a whole, whether it be drama and controversy surrounding video games or upcoming releases, and give you my thoughts on about said controversy and whether or not these games are perhaps worth your time or whether or not people should be paying attention to this shit. As always, I'm your host, Corrupt Ronan, here to bring you that wonderful news that you guys love so much. To the average people who don't really listen to video game news all that much, but are kind of curious about what's been going on. Because regardless of whether or not you care or not, you've probably seen some of this shit floating around the internet somewhere, unfortunately. For today's episode, we got a lot of stuff to talk about, because there is indeed more controversy surrounding games like Black Myth Wukong, on top of the conundrum that is Concord and why that game is continuing to see low sales overall and generally just no interest whatsoever, as you can see on the thumbnail itself for today's episode. So, I got a lot to talk about. Without further ado, let's just jump right into this thing. So perhaps you might have seen some news on the internet, whether it be on social media rounds or just gaming access media in general, talking about Black Myth Wukong and its, influence over the culture, or what people are calling the culture war. Now, I've seen both sides of this argument in terms of the culture war, saying that both sides are stupid for dragging the game into the culture war, and on the other side, they're saying that, oh, it's the gamers that are crazy and they're the ones dragging this into the culture war. But regardless of your stance of whether or not it's dumb or there's some reasonability to it, this all did happen for a reason. Rewind back to a year ago, roughly around November of 2023, and I talked a little about this on last week's episode, the pilot episode, where Black Myth Wukong was quote-unquote facing some controversy and complications due to sexism and misogyny of the developer's history of said things. Having done my own research within said article, and people that have also done their own research, they found that regardless of whether or not you agree with the director of the game or the studio's comments in the past, regardless of how crude, rude, or inappropriate they are, most people found that sexism or sexist, they were not. In fact, most of the inappropriate comments were really about male genitalia at the end of the day. Some of them were kind of humorous. But regardless of how you feel about teenage edgy humor as a whole, none of those particular comments were sexist by the definition. What was strange about this is that even when people pointed this out, this particular article continued making the rounds around access media and websites of that ilk. Take PC Gamer, for example, who took it upon themselves at every event they were invited to talk about the game, and to the developers themselves. They continued to hound the developer. Get this on screen real quick. Continued to hound the developer about their quote-unquote sexist remarks, to which Game Science's reply was no comment. Now, some people might find that as a bit weird. You would think, well, if you didn't say these things or you disagree with them, why would you just say that that you didn't actually mean it that way? But when you have to take into account that the people who wrote the article have been on record as having a axe to grind with the studio as a whole, you begin to understand why people might not trust the translations that were used in the article to be in good faith. Because when you've been on record slamming the studio before and even telling people to pirate the game, instead, you kind of color your intent with said translations. Say what you will about the gaming community as a whole, but they're not so stupid as to not pick up on ill intent when it comes to games and developers as a whole. So the question is, are they wrong for feeling that way? Are they wrong for being a little upset with IGN over this entire debacle to begin with? Let me get this out of here and go back to the main page real quick, because I got more for you. Hold on. There we go. Okay. Damn, I come into this chaotic topic. That's right. It's chaotic. There's a whole lot of shit going on right now. So where does the culture war fit into this whole thing? Well, it kind of kicked off because, for one, there's a growing level of mistrust between gamers and access media, places like IGN, Screen Rant and Game Rant and GameSpot and all that fun stuff. There's a growing level of mistrust, which people tend to dub as Gamergate. We'll call it that. But when you see articles like this, and you see the people behind said articles and their intent behind the articles, when you see them get upset, when you see the people behind said articles get upset and even depressed over the idea of the game being successful, it kind of paints a picture of what the intent of the article actually was. Even more so when you consider that one of those authors decided to take themselves to a heavily left-leaning forum, such as ResetEra, for example, to talk about how they're feeling about the game's success, and how much they continue to push said article about the quote-unquote sexism of game science itself without any actual proof of them actually being sexist, even if the comments themselves were considered rude and crude, and many people don't agree with. But anybody who took it upon themselves to simply ask questions about the article itself and even the intent, even the most level-headed and nuanced people on that forum, simply asking questions about the intent of the article. Okay, just gonna show you something real quick. Hold on. Let me show you something. Let's see, where did I put that image? There we go. Let me show you something. Simply asking questions about the intent of the article itself is enough to get you banned on the forum. As you can see here, this person simply asks, does that mean that some people are using this game as an opportunity to bring more global attention to the overall state of feminism in China? Free speech is free speech. But if so, I can see why some games are reacting to this tactic negatively, for how the original allegations have been blown up into a bigger conflict of deals. Promptly banned. Just for asking a question about the intent of the article. And to be fair, that doesn't seem like an unreasonable ask. When you look at the article itself and the content within it, the claims they made and how that doesn't match up with the quote-unquote translations that they pulled up about this individual or peoples that work in the company, but are promptly and took even an entire section of said article to talk about women's rights and feminism within China. Is it strange for a person to ask, is the real intent behind this entire article just to push feminism in China? A country that is known for its communist and authoritarian values, by which its citizens barely even have a voice? Is it really that much of a surprise when people start losing their absolute minds when the developers issue requirements for streamers playing the game to follow? I don't know why this keeps trying not to show what I'm trying to show on screen. It's weird. For streamers to follow about said game, which includes things like feminist propaganda and fetishization, or things like quarantine or isolation or COVID-19. Is it really that much of a surprise to see things like this coming from a country like China? Even if the developers don't agree with this stuff themselves, their government alone requires them to care about it. Says CCP going to come for someone's head. It's really strange to be this upset about that when you consider the country of origin that the developers themselves are in and that the game is coming from. Regardless, the game still sold incredibly well, and people will try to downplay that success by saying, well, it's mostly Chinese people that bought the game. Even prominent content creators will try to downplay the game's success or the people rallying behind the game's success by saying, oh, well, it's mostly just Chinese people that bought the game. I did my own research into this subject, and I talked a little bit about this last week in regards to the sales of the game. It is true that the majority of people that bought the game are indeed the Chinese audience, okay? However, when you look at player counts on Steam, let's pull up Black Myth Wukong. One thing I love about the SteamDB website is that it keeps track of this shit. Details that you wouldn't really think about until it comes to talking about this shit, and then you start trying to find this stuff, and by that point, it's incredibly important. But you'll notice a pattern here. I'm going to show this on screen. Do that. Boom, boom, boom. So here are the charts for Black Myth Wukong right now. Currently, there are 611,000 players playing the game. The last peak in the last 24 hours was 1.4 million players. If you look at the charts here and the graphs, you'll see when those peak times happen. It's like constant mountains. These particular peaks on this graph is usually when Chinese players are either awake or at home and have time to play the game. And you'll notice that when that does change, and perhaps they're asleep or either at work, the numbers drop. You get these dips. However, the lowest dip of the game still puts the game in the hundreds of thousands of players range, a number that most games can't even hope to achieve. So even without the Chinese player base, that number is still significant. So regardless of whether or not it's the Chinese player base playing the game or it bought the game, people outside of China that bought the game is still quite significant. But this is coming from people that are trying to downplay the game's success. Now you have to ask, well, okay, first of all, I don't really care all that much about this stuff in the first place, and why can't people just play games and not care about the controversy surrounding it? There is a reason why a lot of people are starting to care now. And like I said in last week's episode, before all of this, I considered myself a normie, a person who didn't really care about all the drama surrounding games and just wanted to play video games, make good games, and I'll play them. But as this shit continued, she says, if it was a Western release and a bunch of Chinese players bought it, it would not count. Yeah, exactly. So the question is, like I said before, like why is everybody caring now? Why is this such an issue, and why did it get dragged into the culture war? It's because people are starting to notice the crusade behind trying to bury this game and its success. Because the people behind the original article clearly had some kind of axe to grind with game science themselves. And the reason why this is important and why the collusion between media outlets, keep in mind, like I said at the beginning of this, not only did this article float around at the beginning, but a lot of access media websites decided to quote that article in every piece they wrote about the game. Even if the piece was positive about the game's visuals, the gameplay, everything else, they continued to lace every article with the IGN article about the supposed sexism and misogyny in the company. And what's even weirder about that article is that the people they talked to about said comments and quote unquote misogyny, none of them actually worked at Game Science. They didn't talk to a single person that had worked there or works there. The people they did talk to were people on the auxiliary, the outside, looking in. The occasional female Chinese developer who might have had some negative opinions about said comments, but they didn't talk to anybody within the studio itself. And if you look at the title of that article, you would think to yourself, well, wait a minute. Is this shit going on inside the studio? Did the employees do something to the female employees in the studio? None of that in the article whatsoever. That is why this is so weird and why people are kind of rallying against it. So the question is, who really dragged Black Myth Wukong into the culture war? Well, when you break down all the events that happened since the game's initial trailer, leading up to the article last year and up to today, it's Access Media. But they'll be the ones to say that it's the gamers that are the ones that are dragging it into it. When there is already a growing distaste for things that people consider quote unquote woke in media, including video games, the one game that decides not to do any of that, being heralded as an example of, hey, developers, you don't have to put this shit in your games for your game to succeed. Is it a wonder why people are trying to attack this game? A shining example of, you don't have to put LGBTQ shit in the game. You don't need the pronouns. You don't need representation. It's a game about monkeys fighting other mythical creatures, and it's sold incredibly well. It's not that the gamers are rallying behind this as a form of anti-woke. They're just saying, hey, listen, this stuff isn't required for your game to be good. Now, that's not to say that there are people out there that are indeed trying to rally behind it for the sole purpose of the anti-woke crusade that there is. And some people out there that have, unfortunately, I hate to use the word grifting, but there is a lot of that, unfortunately, on places like YouTube, for example. And you'll see a lot of that. But overall, the majority of the gaming community are just like, listen, we just want good games. And you don't need all of that shit in it for the game to be good. Oh boy. Okay. What else? What else do I got to say about this? I got a lot of notes. There's a whole bunch of shit to go over. Oh yes, the rallying behind the I guess the distrust for gamers and journal access media as a whole, and why this is slowly becoming a increasing problem as a whole. Why is it that people are starting to distrust gaming media as a whole? Well, there is a reason for that, and there's a reason why this is important. When it comes to major events, like let's say the Game Awards, for example, an event that bills itself as the voice for gamers. Yet, when it comes to the voting process, gamers' voice only counts for 10% of the vote, where the remaining 90% is Access Media. Now, when you go to the Game Awards website, they say the reason why they do this is because they're trying to ensure that the voices behind the votes in the gaming industry are diverse and different, coming from different angles and different cultures. Yet, when you consider all the websites that they use as the jury for the voting process, they all lean the same way. So my question to you is, how is that diverse? When these websites are claiming to be the voice of gamers, have access to publishers, developers alike, inside sources, claiming to be the voice for you. The question is, do you want these people to be your voice? Should they be your voice? When it's clear that as time has gone on, they have slowly gotten out of touch with the general gaming community at large. Let me move this out of the way real quick. Doing this thing solo, ladies and gentlemen, flying by the seat of our pants sometimes. The question that I ask for the majority of gamers out there, especially those that are finding themselves really distrusting Access Media, while at the same time seeing the level of influence they have when it comes to video games, development of video games, the sources or the developers or the ears of developers that these people have directly, where they can influence just by simply making up articles about a website or about a developer being sexist and misogynist without any actual proof of that. The question is, do you want these people speaking for you? When it comes to the Game Awards, where your voice only counts as 10% of the vote, where the representatives from Access Media counts as the majority, the question then becomes, do you want these people to speak for you? When there is a decreasing quality of games that has happened over the past 5 or 6 years at this point, and gamers have been on record specifically stating what they like and don't like in games, and it is deliberately ignored or written off as bigotry, racism, misogyny, hatred, by the very same media outlets that have the ears of these developers, do you want these people speaking for you? If the answer is no, that is why this shit is important. But just to ensure that you know I'm not speaking out of my ass, let me ask you this. Is it safe to assume that the translations of an article are indeed done in good faith when one of the co-authors of said article is constantly on record saying things exactly like this? Do I hate white people? Yes. And if you're a friend, you'll understand why this is never personal. I hate white privilege so much, their ability to scream reverse racism when faced with a tiny bit of criticism. The world revolves around them, even in Singapore, every single day. Imagine someone who you think is your friend saying, I hate your entire race. But it's not personal. Now listen, I am not the smartest person in the world. I'll be the first to tell you that. All right? But that sounds pretty goddamn personal to me. Again, I ask, do you want these people speaking for you? Even more so when you consider something like this. The same person being upset because of the backlash they received from the article. So much so that they threw game science into it, saying, fuck game science and all the grifters who are doing this to one of my favorite people in the industry, because the other co-author of the article decided to go off the grid because of the amount of backlash they were getting for said article. Now, I'm not one to particularly praise people who do things like send death threats. I always say all the time, I'm of the mindset that don't engage with these people whatsoever, and don't do shit like that because it doesn't help. But on the internet, people are going to do that shit anyways because it's the internet. You got trolls out there that get their kicks out of doing shit like this. So it's practically unavoidable. Regardless, my question to you is, what the fuck does game science themselves have to do with any of this? They weren't the ones telling people to do this shit. You can have an issue with the people with the grifters, for example, and the people that are harassing you over the article itself. But what the fuck does game science have to do with this? And I find it funny now that piracy is suddenly okay, which is hilarious considering that the game has de novo, which in the piracy community is one of the most time-consuming and difficult to crack DRMs out there, for the reason why so many games that have de novo in them have yet to be cracked. So that whole pirate thing, probably not going to happen. But again, I ask, are these the people you want speaking for you? That is why this shit is important. But I'm not here to make this entirely about the drama surrounding Black Myth, regardless of how important and fucking insane it is currently. I would like to get my thoughts on the game as a whole, as somebody who has in fact been playing through it. And honestly, I think the game is fantastic. Like the visuals are fantastic. I love how massive the world is, while not being open world at the same time. But each area you go to is like massive in a sense that it almost makes it feel like an open world game, without being subject to a lot of the problems that open world games have. Like, for example, the checklist behavior that comes straight out of Ubisoft games, that no matter how many studios that aren't Ubisoft try to avoid, they still fall down that same fucking path in their open world games. This game, much like Elden Ring, also avoids that problem by making sure that the side quests themselves are well integrated into the world itself, and that the world itself is not so large that you find yourself not really wanting to bother with some of the side activities because they're so far out of the way. This is more of a opened, condensed experience, or as the developers of Uncharted 4 used to say back in the day with that game, consider it more of a wide, linear experience, where the main objective is always the same, and the direction you have to go to proceed to the main story is the same, but there's a whole bunch of shit outside of that you can do. You can get into by simply wandering around and exploring. And none of it is so far out of the way that you feel like you're always lost at all times, or that it's too much effort to go out of your way to find that stuff. And that has been fantastic because there's a ton of secret bosses, a ton of cool items to find, a ton of cool gear to get. And if you're a loot goblin like I am, the game definitely scratches that itch so far. Not to say that it's perfect. I do have some issues with at least some of the bosses in the games and the way some of the bosses are designed. And I kind of talked about this during a Halo stream with Mika, that I've noticed a lot of especially Souls games, like Elden Ring, for example, are starting to fall into, where a lot of bosses have ridiculously long attack strings, where you find yourself simply waiting for their attack string to end just to get in a few hits and then rinse and repeat. Like, you're better off just standing back and waiting for the enemy to simply finish his attacks so that you can finally go in and get an attack in. And you might get maybe one attack in, maybe two, before they go right back into the same pattern of the extremely long attack chains. We're talking anywhere from 5-hit combos to 6, 7, 8-hit combos, where you're better off just sitting around and waiting for that. And there are quite a few periods in some boss fights where you simply just can't hit the boss at all because they have invincibility frames for specific attacks. There was a boss I fought in last stream, which had I forgot what that thing is called. Chakrams, that's what they're called. The rings, the bladed rings, and they would light on fire. And at a specific point during that boss fight, he would turn into the rings themselves, and it would be a sequence of you just sitting around and waiting and dodging his attacks. But during that phase, you can't attack him. All you can do is just sit there and wait until that attack ends, and that attack goes on for a long time. A second boss I fought, which is an optional boss in this hidden area, and it's a boss that you can talk to and challenge to a boss fight, not to spoil too much about it. But one of his gimmicks is that he has the ability to disappear. And that's a common thing in this game so far, is bosses that can teleport. And this guy can also do it too, where he can disappear and reappear in front of you and attack. However, in the middle of that phase, whenever he reappears, you can't attack him. Even if you swing at him, when he reappears, it's all iframes. You can't damage him. You have to wait until that period ends before you can finally start attacking again. Stuff like that is kind of what drags a few of the boss fights down. And the sheer number of bosses that can teleport in that game is a bit much, as teleporting bosses in general it's kind of a lazy gimmick. And you start to see a lot of boss designs using that quite often. So that is indeed one of my big issues with the game so far. But overall, I am having a great time with it so far. And honestly, it's one of those things where you can clearly tell that this game was a labor of love, not only for video games as a whole, but for Chinese folklore and its culture. And you can see that all throughout the game, from the intricately designed areas that take inspiration from real locations in China, down to the ending cutscenes at the end of each chapter that are either animated or hand animated like cartoons, or like the one I saw at the end of chapter 2, which was more of a stop motion clay animated thing. Like that's fantastic. And even better is that there's like a lack of things that interrupt you during the game, like cutscenes, for example. When you're playing that game, you are playing the game. The only time the game really stops you is cutscenes for boss fights. But when they give you the control, you have the floor for a long period of time to just go off and do whatever you want. And like Raku says in the chat, no microtransactions in DLC. However, I will slight them on this one thing. There is an item that you can get that only comes with a deluxe edition that kind of gives you a slight advantage in combat in terms of attack speed and things like that. And that is exclusive to the deluxe edition. So that's kind of shitty. But when you consider what this game is and how it doesn't necessarily include all of the issues that most games have today, like microtransactions and copious amounts of DLC, you can kind of see why gamers are heralding this thing as a beacon of what to do with video games, because it does damn near everything that gamers say they want. It's not just about it being quote unquote anti-woke. There's a lot more to it. That's not to say that it doesn't have a component to this whole debacle, but it is not the only reason why the game is being praised so heavily. And why people are having such a issue with these outlets trying to downplay the game's success. And it was weird, even weirder considering I listened to, actually, there was some commentary from a few few Chinese YouTubers out there and people on social media in general talking about this particular controversy and how a lot of it made it back to Chinese social media networks. And at the time, when people got a hold of the posts and stuff like that that came from the co-founders of the studio, even then, they had gotten backlash from Chinese people on Chinese social media networks. That was a whole year before IGN even got a hold of this stuff. So the studio had already gotten plenty of backlash for the comments already. Could you imagine that? You already get called out for some shit that you said on social media by the citizens of your own country on social media networks. And when the flames finally start dying down, here comes IGN's ass trying to fan them back up again. A whole year later. And you can see why they really didn't want to comment on any of this shit, no matter how many times they were asked at press events. Like at that point, I can imagine you being so tired of talking about it and being so tired of being ridiculed about it. You're like, fuck it. Because no matter what I'm going to say is going to get taken out of context. So why say anything at all? No comment. Anyways, that is Black Myth Wukong. Sorry that went on for so long, but there's a lot to talk about in that game and just how the impact it has over the wider gaming culture as a whole. It's not necessarily just about it being quote-unquote anti-woke or the people who are anti-woke heralding it as being anti-woke, because the game itself isn't deliberately out there talking about how bad pronouns are or how evil LGBTQ is. It doesn't have any of that stuff in it. It's the fact that it doesn't have any of that stuff in it or real-world politics that people are enjoying about it. It is refreshing in that sense. Mika, I'm evil. The game not necessarily having that stuff in it doesn't always particularly mean that it's anti that. It just means that it doesn't need that shit to be good. And that's what people are trying to tell these morons in Access Media who continue to go on tirades about how evil the gamers are for simply praising the game for being just that, a good video game. But that's enough about Black Myth Wukong. Let's talk about Concord. And why that game is unfortunately seeing the abysmal player numbers and sales that it is right now. There was some news that came out recently saying that the game had sold roughly around 25,000 copies as a whole. And that's across all platforms. We're talking PC, consoles, you name it. That is incredibly low. Regardless of how you feel about that, that is incredibly low. And the Steam numbers definitely tell quite a tale. When the game launched, which I guess will be roughly around a week ago at this point, right? It saw a peak player count of concurrent player count on Steam of 697 players. Obviously not very high, even for a game at that low of a price. So the question is, why did this game launch to such abysmal numbers? Some people will tell you that it's solely the woke bullshit in the game, and others will tell you that it's the barrier to entry. That is the price point, the $40 price point, when its competitors that are doing far better are free to play. Others will tell you that it's the game's poor marketing and how it didn't really sell itself that well since the day it was revealed. What if I told you that it's all of the above? However, the woke shit in the game is a massive contributing factor. And I'll get into why. The game's character designs overall, you know it's bad when even the people that most would consider woke are also calling it out for the character designs being completely butt ugly. From the overall aesthetic to the character designs, there is nothing appealing about the game whatsoever. And what I found even more hilarious, and I mentioned this on a couple of streams, is that when the game debuted or revealed itself on Sony State of Play back in, what was it, May at this point? It was one of the first games shown during that State of Play. I remember this even now. They showed the footage, and me and Wolf were talking about it. And then Vancy comes back to the chat, and she goes, and her first question is, what did I miss? And I said, oh, that's like, how do you feel about, a hero shooter, that's almost like Destiny, and you shoot people, and they got powers and all that stuff. And without her having even seen any footage of the game or even knowing what the game was, her first reaction was pass. And honestly, in my opinion, that pass can be mapped to the entire gaming community as a whole. That is generally how people feel about this game. On top of the fact that the character designs are unappealing. There is a reason for that, though. Because in a lot of, let's say, modern games these days, the typical mindset in development studios is, well, we need to defeat the conventional means of attractiveness in games. We need to defeat the male gaze. So they deliberately go out of their way of making sure that these characters have no sexual appeal whatsoever. Now, some people would say that it's wrong to judge a book by its cover. And in a perfect, ideal fantasy world, that would be true. But the reality is that you're not going to get people to even open or pick up the book if the cover is not attractive. You're not going to get people to try your food in your restaurant if you can't get them in the front fucking door. The problem with this game is it has nothing to get people past the front fucking door. You look at its competitors. You look at these competitors, like in Overwatch, for example. How did Overwatch become successful? Well, for one, it was one of the first hero shooters on the market. It was doing something new at the time. However, one of the big components of why that game was so successful is that the character designs were indeed attractive. Tracer, some people would call the mascot of Overwatch. Is it a surprise that when the game launched, porn websites saw an increase in searches for specific characters from Overwatch? It topped search results for years. People that didn't even know what the fuck Overwatch was looking at spicy content of the game. OnlyFans models built entire careers off of cosplaying as the characters from Overwatch. You guys remember that? Remember back in the day where they had to change Tracer's pose, her over the shoulder pose, because people complained about the fact that it was showing her butt? And they didn't like that. Remember that shit? It was sex appeal that sold Overwatch. You don't have to like sex appeal. You don't have to like fan service. But what you cannot deny is that shit will sell. And that is a tale as old as time. Sex sells. It always has. It always will. And no amount of shaming, ridicule, or anything in between is going to change that. There's something I heard. It was a quote that I heard for a long time ago from someone. I forgot who it was because, when it comes to remembering shit from people like that, my mind is already a jumbled mess as it is. And trying to remember exact people who made said quotes and putting that together is kind of a mess. But I remember the exact quote is, attraction is non-negotiable. People like what they like. You cannot shame them out of liking what they like. Your crusade to defeat conventional means of attractiveness is never going to work, because if people don't find your shit attractive, they ain't gonna bother listening to it or even playing it. The whole, so attractiveness is subjective thing. That is true to an extent. Let's put it to you this way. Las Vegas, what people call a Sin City. It's one of the cities that has perhaps one of the most breadth of bikini competitions within them. But the people that run those competitions have data in regards to the kinds of women that win in these competitions, to the point where the pattern is so recognizable that they can literally predict what type of girl is going to win those competitions every single time. And it's always the same type of girl. Every single time. You cannot negotiate an attraction. I'm sorry. It is what it is. And unfortunately, Concord has nothing in it that fits that bill. You can sit here and pretend that is not a big contributing factor to the reason why no one is playing this game, but it is. But perhaps you don't believe me. Perhaps I need to drive this point home even further. So I'll just say this, and I'll ask you to remember this. When it comes to noticing commonalities in various events, pattern recognition to the oblivious will seem like psychic ability. When this game was revealed, people took one look at it and said, this game is going to fucking fail. If you go to the game's reveal trailer, the very first trailer that came out, and look at the YouTube comments, fucking brutal. From the dislike ratio to the comments, people deliberately called out that this game was going to fail. Not because they're psychic, it's because they recognize a pattern. Oh, no, the initial reaction was that it was going to be cool. No. Everybody looked at that and said, nah. They looked at the character designs and said, nah, this is not happening. You look at those comments, you'll see for yourself. But yeah, I'll drive this home again. See, where's that at? Here we go. I'm going to say this. This is a quote that I've also heard as one. I keep forgetting who's the one who said this. Like, again, when it comes to quotes, I can remember the quotes themselves, but the people that said them, sometimes that shit gets jumbled up and lost in my mind. But follow along with me. Let me take this back all the way back to the beginning. Hold on. Okay. Once is an accident. Twice is coincidence. 3 times is a pattern. I'll say it again. Once is an accident. Twice is coincidence. 3 times is a pattern. One more time for the people in the back. Once is an accident. Twice is coincidence. 3 times is a pattern. You cannot negotiate attraction. You cannot negotiate the impact that it has on people's purchasing decisions. One look at the character designs in a game like Zenless Zone Zero, and you can see why that game is so goddamn popular in China and the global market as a whole, and why that game is making so much fucking money. You cannot negotiate that. These games are killing it right now. The games from the Asian markets are absolutely destroying the Western market right now because they have an understanding of what people want. Again, you don't have to like fan service, but to sit there and be an idiot denying its impact it has over people's buying decisions and getting people's attention, I hate to break it to you, but you're a fucking idiot. Now let's go back to the slideshow real quick, because some of you might have seen some of the games to talk about here, such as Mecha Break and Marvel Rivals. As you can see up there, it says Marvel Rivals Playtest. That number you see there, that was the peak amount of players that the game had during its playtest. Now, I mean, I found it weird that this was information I got from last night, so I find it a little weird that the playtest is over, yet it still had users, said that it still had users somehow still in the games. I'm still trying to figure out how that one works. Maybe those are developers or something else is going on, but I'm not quite sure how you're in the game when the playtest ended over a month ago. But I digress. The other game I showed was Mecha Break, a game that also saw a total of 51,000 players in its peak just a little over 2 weeks ago. That was during its playtest. One of the commonalities that these games has is not only that the gameplay is fun, but the character designs themselves are also quite attractive, especially in Mecha Break's case, where the game literally has a butt jiggle physics slider for characters that you don't really see all that often because the game is a mecha game. You see the mechs most of the time. Then there's the first Descendant, which just last month saw a peak of 264,000 players. And at the time that I got this image, there were 47,000 people in the game. What does this game have in common with those other two? The character designs are attractive. And the developers understand this because one of the trailers that came out detailing their new season of content, the first 5 seconds of the trailer literally has the new Descendant's butt right in the fucking screen. So it's not like the developers are not aware of this. They are. They're leaning into it. And as you can see on the player counts, it's fucking working. Whereas these other games, none of that. And you can see why they're not doing so hot. And it's even worse considering that people that have played games like Concord, for example, say that the game's gameplay is actually quite decent. But what did I say earlier? No one's going to care if you can't get them through the front fucking door. I saw Dustboard in that game like you play like ass. Yeah, I mean that's kind of a common thing about it. But even when you get past the gameplay itself and dig into the game story, and I got to talk about Dustboard. That's another one that's on the list of topics to talk about as well. That one I'm going to go over briefly, but yeah, that's another one as well. Dustboard is a whole thing all its own. But what is the big takeaway from all this when it comes to Concord? You can get mad about the male gaze all you want to, but like I said last week, and even showed in the infograph, no matter how you like or dislike it, the majority demographic of people that play games are in fact male. That 50-50 shit you hear about 50% of gamers being male and 50% of gamers being female, that's bullshit. Absolute bullshit. And I'll tell you why. Because when you break down the numbers, the actual numbers of those percentages, you find an interesting dichotomy of what happens with those gamers. And I actually have something here that I want to show you. Let me find it in my list of shit here. I pulled up a lot of tabs yesterday while doing research for this shit. I pulled up a hell of a lot of tabs, so get ready for some more infographics, folks. Brace yourselves. This is an infographic from a website called Quantic Foundry. Part of their job is pretty much data collection when it comes to like a multitude of things in the gaming industry. What you're seeing here is the genre preferences of female gamers. As you can see at the top, the majority of people that play Match 3 and Family/Farm Sims are in fact female. Okay? Now you might ask yourself, well, I mean, those are still games, so shouldn't that still consider these people to be gamers? My answer is no. And here's why. You're not going to be able to get mom or grandma from playing Candy Crush on their phone to jumping into a game like Black Myth Wukong, which is an action RPG. It doesn't work like that. That is why I consider the mobile market to not necessarily be a gamer market, because these games alone can appeal to the older crowd, but you're not going to somehow transition that older crowd of people that enjoy these very simple games that they can play in a few minutes into a 40-hour long action RPG like Black Myth Wukong or Dark Souls or Final Fantasy or whatever it might be. It's just not going to happen. I also find it funny that this 2% of female players, 2% of the genres for sports is female players, and it's like I kind of understand where that might come from. Like, if anyone has ever been in a relationship before, which I'm sure many of us here have, you will find that, well, a lot of women will get into sports because their boyfriend or husband is into said sports. That is not uncommon. That is not uncommon. And sometimes they might jump into sports games because of that. You might have some female gamers that are legitimately into sports, but women as a whole don't care about sports to the same degree that men do. So I found it to be pretty interesting just to see that by itself. Now, bear in mind, this is a graph that came back from, let's say, I think it was 2017, based on what I've seen so far. And we're in 2024. But I can't imagine these numbers looking that different even today. Perhaps the RPG genre itself might have changed a bit with the influx of gacha games, for example, with games like Genshin Impact and Zenless Zone Zero or Wuthering Waves, for example. Very easy to get the female crowd into that because those are also phone games. Easy to pull up on a phone, free to play, and jump into. And if there's a lot of attractive male characters in that game, then they're going to attach to that. So I can see that particular genre being a little bit different today because of that alone. But overall, I can't see these numbers really being that different, even by today's standards. In other words, the market is predominantly male. It doesn't matter whether you like it, you can love it, hate it, doesn't matter. The reality is that's the truth. To drive one more point home about this whole attractive video game characters thing, you guys are going to love this one. You guys are going to love this one. Remember that graph I showed last week from Capcom in regards to the difference in demographic between male and female players, where it deliberately showed that 80% of the people that took the survey were indeed male? Let me try to pull up that graphic one more time, because there's more to that graph that I didn't show last week that I am going to show today. Let's see if I can find it here. Where the fuck is that thing? I just had it, and now it's gone. I know it's in here somewhere. Hold on. Hold on. There we go. This is it right here. In that survey, they had a number of results based on the questions that they asked. All right. One of those questions was, what do you look for in Capcom games? And whatever, I'll just let the results speak for themselves. As you can see, the top 3 results of this survey: number 1, exhilarating gameplay, which makes sense. It's a fucking video game, right? You're going to want the gameplay to be good. However, right underneath that is unique and attractive characters, coming in at number 2, followed by unpredictable and exciting storyline as number 3. I would go so far as to say that all 3 of those things are important. What is Concord lacking? Number 2, right there. Just because your game has attractive characters does not mean that your gameplay can't be exhilarating as well. 2 of those things can be true at the exact same time. You don't have to trade one for the other. You can have both of those things be true. Anyways, those are my thoughts on the Concord situation. I mean, you can sit there and try to cope all you want to about why that game failed, and you have a lot of access media websites like a PC Gamer or Forbes or a Kotaku or an IGN saying that surely it can't be the woke shit in video games causing this problem, even though the answers are staring them right dead in the fucking face that, yeah, it is having an impact. And like I said before, I'm not too keen on the word woke itself because it does get overused quite a bit and misused quite a bit. However, there is indeed truth to that, and you are seeing that happen right in front of you, live. Okay, off of Concord. Let's talk about let's talk about Visions of Mana real quick, and then I'll jump into the Dustborn stuff as the tail end, the cap at the end of this entire episode. So, just yesterday, in fact, it was announced that the studio behind Visions of Mana, the game that literally just came out yesterday, is closing. Oh, question in the chat. Also, one more thing on Concord. So, Sony bought the studio before they put anything out, didn't they? They did, yeah. Like, Firewalk Studios was a brand new studio itself, and Sony bought them. Bear in mind that the people within the studio were ex-Bungie devs, people that worked on Destiny and Destiny 2. So, I guess they probably thought that these guys had enough of a pedigree under their belt that they couldn't do any wrong, or at least that they would know what it would take to make a video game that's attractive, at least, because they worked on games like Destiny 2. But as you can see, that's clearly not enough. That's clearly not enough. Oh shit. And I also wanted to say this too, because I felt like this is also really important. There was news, I want to say a few months back, that broke out about Xbox, Microsoft, advising developers to not make curvy or attractive female gamer or female characters in their games. I kid you not. That is a thing that exists. I forgot exactly the article I saw about that. But there is. You can Google it for yourself. You'll find it, I assure you. This was coming from Xbox management themselves. They're not saying that they can't do that, but they're trying to recommend that they don't do that. Putting curvy or attractive female characters in games. So to say that there's not a concerted effort to curb people from putting attractive female characters in video games is a lie. Especially when you see things like that. Like when people talk about woke taking over the industry, this is the shit they're talking about. It's not that people don't know what woke is. It's that people deliberately blind themselves to what people are talking about in regards to that very subject. So if Microsoft has a clause saying trying to curb people from doing that, I can't imagine it's all that different from Sony as well. Okay, back to Visions of Mana. The studio is closed down on the day of the game's launch, and I found that a bit strange because I'm like, is it because the game didn't sell well that it happened? But that would be weird in itself because you wouldn't really have, like, the numbers wouldn't be that immediate to close the studio down. And as it turns out, that is indeed the case. It's not because of the game itself is closing down because the, I guess the investors, Tencent and NetEase, are scaling back on their Japanese investments because, well, there's been a lack of real hits from any of the studios that they've, invested into or bought stock into. So a lot of these studios are being shut down. And this was something that has been happening since spring of this year. And it just so happens that the studio behind Visions of Mana was already on that list. So it wasn't because of the game itself, but that this was a wave of closures happening that began since spring of this year. And it's really unfortunate because I don't know how well Visions of Mana has sold so far. The game just came out. I imagine it's probably not pulling in fucking the first Descendant numbers. The first Descendant numbers, I imagine it's not pulling in that. Or whether or not it's even close to something like a Concord, for example. But who knows? But it is unfortunate to see that happen right before they could even see the fruits of their labor come to fruition. Now, I imagine some of those people at the studio probably got brought into, either moved into other studios to work on other games and stuff like that. But yeah, that's really unfortunate. Also, this follows closely after the news that Blue Protocol, which is the anime MMO that launched in Japan, is also shutting down, which honestly I'm not that surprised about, considering that news from that game, for that game, and about that game, whether or not it was hitting stateside or I guess their global release, like they were radio silent about that for over a year. And the news at the time about the game from its Japan release wasn't very positive. So it was only a matter of time before that game shut down too. So Blue Protocol, unfortunately, shutting down as well, and also not releasing globally either. So rest in peace to that too. But we'll round this thing off with Dustborn, as I promised we will talk about that. So what is Dustborn? If I had to describe it, Dustborn is literally the embodiment of what everyone talks about when they say something is woke, quote unquote. That game is the embodiment of all of that shit. From non-binary characters to characters with vitiligo. It's got all that shit. If there's a checkbox for DEI shit in a video game, that game is checking every last one of those motherfuckers. It's got all of that in it. On top of the fact that it's also not very good. But what makes things worse, and I mentioned this during the stream yesterday, I asked the question, what is propaganda? Propaganda is a deliberate message that is trying to be pushed, or that somebody wants to be pushed, that is then backed financially and marketing-wise by the government. Ladies and gentlemen, that is Dustborn. A game that was made because the European government funded it. To my European friends, this is what your tax dollars is going to. Games like Dustborn. What makes this weird is because the studio behind it, they don't have a track record of great games. They've been around for quite some time. Their track record's not great. The sales for their games, perhaps even worse. So the question is, how is this studio still around when they haven't had a single banger of a release? It's because they are backed by the European government. Now, I'm not going to speak for, obviously, the Europeans in regards to how they feel about their government being involved in things like this. But in the U.S., if that shit were to be the case, that would be all over the news. When you consider how much distrust we have in our own government over here. And it's another one of those games with very unattractive characters. Like, it might have seen an influx in sales overall. Let's pull out that image again, shall we? Where's that at? Oh, let's go. Here it is. Dustborn. That game peaked at 83 players on launch. 83. And based on what I can tell, because SteamDB also gives you information of how many people actually own the game or potentially own the game. Based on owner estimations here on SteamDB, roughly 3.8 thousand players own the game, at least on Steam right now. I imagine the number is probably larger if you include things like the PlayStation release, because this did come out on PlayStation as well. Or I think it might have come out on Xbox. I have to double check on that. A story that made it innocent because like that wasn't me. I didn't make this shit. We didn't do it. Nuh-uh. She's like, don't blame that on me. I didn't have nothing to do with it. But yes, the writing is also bad. It's one of those things where it's so bad you have to you halfway expect one of the characters to look at the screen and wink at you and say, you see, we did that thing, you know, where we said that white people are always racist. We did that. You get it? Do you like it? Are you proud of us yet? Like, you halfway expect that to happen. And one of the most likable characters in the game is a character that all of the characters absolutely shit on for no reason. And no surprise that it's a male. He researched it more than me. Listen, I kind of had to for the sake of at least having some idea of what I'm talking about. I had to research the shit. I had to research the shit. But yeah, the entire game is an absolute nightmare. Like, I tried to watch people play the game because some people actually attempted to play the game as a joke just to see what was in it so that they knew what they were talking about. And it was very difficult to stomach, from the poor dialogue to the ugly character designs. There's that one character with vitiligo. I don't know. I don't know what it is with this weird recent obsession with characters that have vitiligo in games, whether it be in like Diablo 4, for example, or other games of that ilk. It's really weird. And I kind of relate this back to a conversation that I had with my sister a couple weeks ago. The topic of, we're having a conversation, and the topic of, that's strangely enough, the topic of foot fetishes came up and shit on, and that stuff being on OnlyFans. And my sister told me, she was like, yeah, she's like, there's like a whole wave of that stuff that's been popping up on places like OnlyFans, especially when it comes to feet pictures. And I said, that's interesting. Why do you think that is? She was like, oh, there's a reason for that. And I was like, huh, I wonder what that could be. And then out of nowhere, I had this eureka moment that just popped me, just hit me, just like a ton of bricks. I said, oh shit. And we looked at each other, and I said, it's a chocolate and vanilla thing, isn't it? And she said, yep. And I said, fucking A. That's what it is. The obsession with that shit, especially when it comes to feet fetishes, is the chocolate and vanilla fetish when it comes to vitiligo. I would not be surprised if that's part of the reason there's such a push for that in games. Because vitiligo itself is a very rare condition, okay? I'm talking extremely rare. They have, in that game, they have somebody that has vitiligo, and they also have an albino in the game. Is it a surprise that the albino is also non-binary? Which, when you look at the albino character, and I forget what their name is. Hold on. I forget what their name is. Hold on. Dustborn. What's the name of that character? I want to let you guys figure out what it is. Watch there be like no data on it whatsoever. Like people don't care about this game so much that the characters don't even have names that you can find anywhere. I can't find the name of the character anymore. Good lord. I can't find a character anymore, but I'll put up a picture. How about that? I'll find a picture. I'm going to show you the character, and then I'm going to show you another picture right next to it. All right? So brace yourselves for this. Brace yourselves. We get the image here. Da-da-da. Can I drag and drop this on? I can't. Shit. I got to download it. Fuck. Okay. Whatever. I'll do it. Is it Gnome? Is that the name, Mika? The albino character? Did you find it? Okay, thank you. Let's see if I put that image on screen real quick. Hold on. So I got a lovely image here of the crew for this game. That works. We'll make it bigger. That right there. Fine. Okay. What you're seeing on screen right there, that is the albino character in the game. I'm going to put up another image on screen, and I'm just gonna let it speak for itself. I am just going to let it speak for itself. So I can find a good one here. Hold on. And people who play this game will know exactly what I'm talking about. Oh, it's a bad picture. Hold on. Fuck. We're going to have some fun with this. Hold on. Oh, it's a bad picture. Where's the good one? Where's the good one? I need it to be at the right angle. Give me the right angle. Okay, this might work. This'll work. This'll work. So you have that. The character's name is Gnome in in Dustborn. They're a non-binary albino character. Okay. I'm going to put this picture on the screen, and I want you to try to tell me that you don't see it. I want you to try to tell me that you don't see it. Do that, boom. Okay. Try to tell me that you don't see it. Now, for those who don't know who that is, on the right side, that is Rufus Shinra from Final Fantasy VII. See what? They're the same person. Exactly. Let the people, just let the image speak for itself. So there you go. And even worse now, because the game is kind of coming under fire, or at least it has been coming under fire recently, for apparently stealing assets from GTA 5. There is a moment in the game where the characters are kind of sitting in somebody's apartment, I guess. And the design of said apartment has clearly been ripped straight from one of the locations in GTA 5. I'm talking identical. So the game is kind of getting ripped for that too. You get these eyesores off the screen. Yes, I did call Shinra or Rufus Shinra an eyesore. Not my favorite character. just gonna say it. Not my favorite character. Yeah, that's that. The whole thing with that is just it's bizarre. And like I said before, it is no surprise that this game failed, considering, one, that the marketing behind it was absolutely garbage. Like, they barely showed anything about it. Two, the game looks bad. And three, the characters in it are not even attractive. This game had a whole litany of things working against it. It's no surprise that it didn't sell. When people talk about woke shit in games, this game is that. This game is the embodiment of all that shit. Like, this is what the industry is now. And gamers themselves, even people that would be considered woke by the definition, are kind of getting tired of it. So, let me bring this thing home, because it's already getting longer than 2 as it is. I got to wrap the show up. What's the big takeaways from this? The main takeaway is that there has been a concerted effort to push back against games that do not fall under what a lot of people consider woke guidelines. And I say woke in quotes because it's a term that I hate. But in the absence of anything better to replace it, because there is truth to it, I have to call it by its name. Woke. A lot of people are getting tired of it because they're realizing that a lot of games, in terms of quality, are starting to be affected by the push for this. Amika found the stolen asset pick. All right, I'll put that on screen too while I'm talking about this. Mika's out here assisting with the podcast. Look at this shit. Mika's like the number one assistant, even when she doesn't have to be. I appreciate it. I'll put that on screen while I'm talking. Let's make that bigger for you guys so you can see it. So the game's coming under fire for basically stealing assets from GTA 5. But okay, let me go ahead and get on my concluding diatribe as you see this on the screen. There has been a concerted effort to push this stuff, not just in video games, but in media as a whole. And to no one's surprise that the things that do push this are seeing a significant decrease in sales, whether it be movies from Marvel, movies from Disney and Star Wars, video games in general, there has been a significant decrease because there's been a concerted effort to push all of this shit, the stuff that people considered woke, in quotes, in all of media. And people, even the ones who would generally rally behind woke shit, even people within these communities that most consider woke, are also starting to dislike it. And it's going to continue to happen when the people behind access media deliberately blind themselves to the reality that the consumer is king. And the reason why they're having such a hard time changing and steering the ship back in the other direction is because they are so invested in this shit now that they can't turn back. Concord was a game that was in development for 8 years. Think about that. You'd be feeling some kind of way if you spent 8 years of your life working on a game only for it to come out and get completely reamed because all the shit that people dislike about games, your game is riddled with. But when you have media outlets talking about how gamers don't know what they're talking about, and they're always in your ear because they have connections between you and themselves more than the gamers do, your actual customers who indeed pay for these games. Bear in mind, a lot of this access media, they don't pay for the games. They get access to codes and review codes from the publishers and PR firms themselves, because they have direct lines to these studios and publishers themselves. They have insiders that give them this shit. It is indeed a problem when these people who claim to be voices for gamers have direct access to these publishers and companies, while at the same time completely ignoring what gamers are literally shouting at the rooftop saying that they don't want. And as long as that happens, you're going to have another case of a developer that worked on a game for 8 years, followed all the bullshit that Access Media said or lied to by saying that gamers want, only to find out when the game releases that actually no, the gamers don't want this. When Access Media is deliberately gaslighting developers, publishers, into believing that representation is important, or that your games won't sell, or that because of that your games won't sell, and that there'll be a whole bunch of controversy should you choose to ignore that, deliberately and at times even blackmailing developers, in the case of Sweet Baby Inc., for example. You can see how this is a problem. There have been a lot of layoffs in the industry for the past couple of years. So long as developers continue to ignore what gamers are saying and writing them off as racists, bigots, transphobes, homophobes, Nazis, the layoffs will continue. Anyways, that's all I got for now, guys. That's going to do it for today's episode. Thank you all for bearing with me and being patient as I tried to collate all this information into something that makes sense. Hopefully you guys understand what's been going on here. Hopefully I made some sense of this for those of you that are generally out of the loop, but would like to know what the hell is going on. I'm losing my voice. Part of this due to the fact that I'm operating on 3 hours of sleep on top of that. So that's probably not helping. But yeah, that's all I got for now, guys. I will see you all next week. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the episode. I imagine there's going to be more drama, whether it be about Black Myth Wukong or Concord itself or some other game coming out that likely has drama behind it as well. So I'm sure I'll have plenty to talk about for next week's episode as well. If you guys would like to see me do these more often, please let me know, as I will, if there's enough demand for it, I'll try to make these more of a consistent thing throughout the week instead of a once a week thing. Of course, they'll have to be somewhat shorter in scope because obviously you're doing them more often as opposed to just gathering all the information throughout the week. But like I said, if you guys want more of this, just let me know. There's a whole lot to talk about, and This is also a cathartic way for me to get some shit off my chest as well when it comes to video games. This stuff is important to me as somebody who not just builds its career off of video games themselves and talking about them, but for somebody who loves video games as a whole. I don't take pride in watching the industry I love suffer, because it has been infiltrated by people who want nothing more than to push their own, and I hate to use the word agenda because it's another one that's also been overused, but it is in fact an agenda, into games. Like, developers are no longer making games in hopes that gamers will enjoy them. They're making games to satisfy other activists throughout the industry. Your game is not going to sell that way because those activists don't buy your fucking games. They'll be the first to talk about how great it is that you're putting representation in the game, but they're not going to fucking spend any money on it because they're too busy trying to stick it to the chuds, as they say. Money talks. That they're not buying, then it's an audience you don't need to cater to. Sex sells. It's a tale as old as time. You don't have to like it. You don't have to like fan service, but it's always going to be there. And it is always going to be something to fall back on to get people's attention. There was another quote that I heard from another content creator that I can't remember the name of a long time ago. He used to work in Vegas in the wine and spirits industry. And he said from his boss, he heard something that kind of stuck with him, that also puts Vegas on the map as being, you know, the place where there's a lot of flashing lights and a lot of money wasted. The things he said was, in order to sell something here in Vegas, it's got to be red, it's got to have flames, and it's got to have tits. Even better if it's big red flaming tits. You don't have to like it, but Vegas gets it. That's why it will always be a booming industry. It's why the porn industry will never go bankrupt. No matter how bad of a recession or a depression the rest of the world is. You don't have to like it. That's just reality. Anyways, once again, I'm your host, Corrupt Ronin. Thank you all for listening. I will see you guys next week. Take care. Fade to black.